CNS motor pathways. In this session, we'll cover the following learning objectives: describe the general regions of the brain, locate and list the functions of the motor and sensory cortical regions and their association areas, explain the function of the prefrontal cortex and hypothesize why this brain region may function differently in people, describe the components and function of the brainstem and reticular formation, describe the primary function of the basal ganglia, explain how the cerebellum and cerebral regions control and modify motor programming to produce somatic motor movement. Compare-contrast two types of motor pathways, the direct pyramidal and indirect extrapyramidal. Distinguish between an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron based upon function and cell body location. And compare-contrast the direct and indirect motor pathways. Describe common symptoms with disorders of the motor pathway. Alright, let's get started. Motor pathways, the nervous system, and the skeletal muscle. The brain is an essential part of our body. The brain spinal cord composes of the central nervous system. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and the brain is divided into four major regions. We have the cerebrum, diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Then each of these hemispheres are then divided into functional areas called lobes. The cerebral cortex to the spinal cord and then to the muscle is considered the motor pathway that is responsible for controlling all of our voluntary movements of our body. The pathway is divided into three main parts. First, we have the cerebral cortex. Which is the outer layer of the brain that is responsible for processing sensory information, generating motor commands. The second part is the spinal cord. This is a bundle of nerves that run from the brain and down through the center of the back, and these nerves relay between the brain and the rest of the body, and then they transmitted into the skeletal muscle. The last part is skeletal muscles, which are the muscles that are attached to bone and are responsible for voluntary movement like walking, running, lifting. So the pathway begins in the cerebral cortex, where motor commands are generated and these signals are fired through these nerve bundles called the cortical spinal tract. And then these nerve fibers travel through the brainstem and down the spinal cord to different parts of the body. Once these nerve fibers are in the spinal cord, there's an opportunity for them to synapse through interneurons and cross over to different parts of the body. Lower motor neurons are a type of nerve cell that originate in the spinal cord and brainstem, and they directly go and innervate the skeletal muscle, as you can see over here. They are the final common pathway for transmission for motor signals from the CNS to the muscle, and their activity is essential for producing motion. You'll see over here that the spinal cord is organized somatotopically, in which the more medial parts of the spinal cord correspond to the more proximal medial muscles of the body. And as you go more lateral to the horns, it corresponds to the distal part of the limbs of the body. The lower motor neurons are organized in two main types. We have the alpha motor neurons. These are the large and multipolar neurons that directly innervate skeletal muscle fiber. And these alpha motor neurons are responsible for producing contraction, and their activity is essential for voluntary movements of the body. Then we also have the gamma motor neurons. These are smaller, they're also multipolar, and they innervate specialized muscle fibers called the intrafusal fibers right here. And these intrafusal fibers are found within the muscle spindles. The muscle spindles work by regulating whenever the muscle's length change, and they play a very important role in maintaining balance and posture. A motor unit is described as one motor neuron and all the skeletal muscle fibers that it innervates. It can be very large, where there's one alpha motor neuron innervating many muscle fibers, or a small one where one alpha motor neuron innervates very, very few skeletal muscle fibers. Interneurons play a very important role in the relay of signal. These are a type of nerve cells that are found in the CNS, and they're found inside the spinal cord. They act as intermediaries between the sensory input and the motor output. This allows the brain to integrate and process sensory information before generating commands. They're organized into circuits and are responsible for many functions, including allowing communication of neural impulses between neurons, allow neural impulses to be relayed to several areas within the nervous system at once, and also provide some synchronization in more complex motor pathways. There are some reflex responses that require interneurons to be able to generate a quick signal. And this allows for more accurate perception of the body's position and movement. You can see they're located inside the spinal cord. The functional areas of the brain, the cerebrum, there are three main categories of functional areas. We have the motor areas, the sensory areas, and the association areas. The motor area is what we're going to talk about first. The motor area controls voluntary motor function and is housed inside the frontal lobe of the brain, right here. And this region is termed the primary motor cortex. These axons of the neurons in the primary motor cortex project contralaterally to the brainstem or the spinal cord. And therefore, they can go into each hemispheres and control voluntary muscle activity on the opposite side of the body, right here, the primary motor cortex, shown here in pink. The distribution of the primary motor cortex to various parts of the body can be diagrammed by the homunculus. And the motor homunculus is a disproportionate parts, showing that certain parts of the body will have more degree of precise control than others. An example of this is that you can see the hands are very, very big on the motor homunculus, which means that we have a lot more fine control and dexterity in our fingers than maybe the back of our legs. Motor association areas are adjacent to and connected to the primary motor cortex region. For example, the premotor cortex, right here in yellow, is termed the somatic motor association area, which is found also in the frontal lobe, anterior to the primary motor cortex. And this part is responsible for coordinating learned and skilled motor activities such as reading a book or playing the piano. Someone with damage to this area or significant trauma to this region might not be able to understand words and might have difficulty reading. The components of the motor cortex, primary motor cortex. The distribution of the primary motor cortex innervation, as we said before, is mapped out somewhat topically with the motor homunculus, which is a little man that shows different distribution of how much parts of the body is controlled by the brain. There are also population vectors that can determine the direction of contraction, and is composed of 6 layers. Layer 5 contains these large pyramidal Bet cells. These are specialized neuron cells that are in this middle layer. Over here you can see that the outer layer is a molecular layer. We then have an external granular layer, external pyramidal layer, internal granular layer, internal pyramidal layer, and the polymorphous layer. These different layers of nerve cells will then relay signals to each other. Notice in the primary motor cortex, the internal pyramidal layer is a lot thicker than inside the primary somatosensory cortex, which is a lot smaller. The premotor cortex and the supplementary motor area. The premotor cortex works together with the primary motor cortex, but it sends signals directly down the spinal cord. It controls muscle responses to mostly visual and sound cues. It also stores motor memory, so training to play a piano or a certain move or dance. Controls muscle movement in context. And then the supplementary motor area controls complex or sequential movement, especially in dancing. And it also is implicated in the bilateral muscle movements. It can also be used to determine the amount of strength, distance, and direction required to perform those movements. The associating cortex is located in the prefrontal cortex and inside the posterior part of the parietal cortex, and helps to modify muscle movement initiated by the motor cortex. When it's inside the prefrontal cortex, its main function is to ensure the movement is appropriate, whereas the parietal lobe allows it to have a precision control. So many of these parts have to work together simultaneously to allow a particular muscle activity to be performed. The brainstem. The brainstem is a bidirectional passageway for all tracts ascending from the cerebrum, the midbrain, the cerebellum, to the spinal cord. It is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. This is the main source of indirect extrapyramidal motor tracts and is mainly responsible, and it contains 2 very important nuclei in neurons called the vestibular nuclei and the reticular formation. It does have several other regions, for example, the cerebropeduncle, substantia nigra, the tectum, the corpora quadrigemini. But these regions are important because the midbrain is the final destination for all of the information connecting the cerebrum to the midbrain. There are many bands of these myelinated sensory axons that will extend from the medulla oblongata, and they pass through the pons and midbrain to the thalamus. The reticular formation is a loosely organized core of gray matter that projects through the midbrain pons medulla, and it has components also found in the spinal cord. The main function is that it has a motor component and a sensory component. The motor component is that it allows you to maintain tonus, which is the maintaining of resting muscle tension. It also assists with some of the autonomic functions like blood pressure, heart rate. And the sensory component of this is called the RAS system. There's a RAS component called reticular activating system that is involved in the state of consciousness and being awake. This is how your body receives information by visual and auditory. And the vestibular nuclei connects to the cranial nerve number 8, which provides information regarding posture, equilibrium, and even vision. So all these areas are related to visual and auditory cues. The cerebral nuclei. The cerebral nuclei, also known as the basal nuclei, is this irregular paired mass of gray matter that is buried deep within the central white matter of our cerebral hemispheres. It is inferior to the lateral ventricle, and its old name is called the basal ganglia. Same thing as basal nuclei, same thing as cerebral nuclei. The term ganglia should be only reserved for a cluster of neurons that are located in the PNS. So in general, the function of the basal nuclei is to help regulate our motor output initiated by that cerebral cortex. It eliminates unwanted motions that could be jerky, and especially those that are seen in patients that have Parkinson's or Huntington's disease. There are multiple components of the basal nuclei that we're going to talk about. First, it has a C-shaped caudate nucleus that is large and slender, and it curves around the ventricle. And its main function is to correlate to the arm and leg motions when walking, the caudate nucleus. Next, we're going to have the putamen. The putamen's main function is to control muscular movement at the subconscious level, while the globus pallidus, which is another set of nuclei, both excites and inhibits the activities of the thalamus. So it controls this pink area by regulating how much signal gets to go through. And this then adjusts muscle tone. The last structure that you don't see is called a colostrum. And the colostrum is a sliver of gray matter that is located internal to the cortex of the insula. And its main function is for integrating consciousness and multiple senses. Let's not forget that at the posterior side of our caudate, we're going to have a little region called the amygdaloid body. And the amygdaloid body is an expanded tail region that is involved in expressions for emotion and behavioral activity. Diseases like Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease is a very slow progressive neurological breakdown of some of these nuclei in the brain, causing you to lose movement and balance, leading to a jerky involuntary motion in some parts of the body or even regions of the face. The thalamus's main role is to continuously send excitatory signals to the motor cortex, but it gets regulated by the globus pallidus and the putamen. The basal nuclei then regulate the thalamus by utilizing two key neurotransmitters. We have glutamate, which is going to be the yes excitatory signal, so it increases the activity, and then GABA, which is going to be the no signal or the decreasing input. So over here is a pathway that shows you how this works. The basal nuclei can send signals to stimulate the internal globus pallidus. It can also send GABA to inhibit. Basal nuclei's main role is to inhibit the external globus pallidus, and the globus pallidus will then inhibit the subthalamic nuclei, which will then, when inhibited, excite the internal globus pallidus. The internal globus pallidus' main function is to then inhibit the thalamus, because the thalamus continually sends signals to the motor cortex. So there's a lot of inhibition and stimulation to regulate the fine tuning of muscle contraction. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain and develops from that midbrain to produce fine control over muscle actions. It also plays a role in storing memories of these movement patterns, such as learning how to precisely perform a dance. The cerebellum also modulates these nerve impulses from the motor cortex. It's composed of the right and left hemispheres, connected by a structure called the vermis that links it together. The outer superficial layer is mostly gray matter, and the deeper parts is going to be white matter. There are these very thick nerve tracts called the cerebellar peduncles that play a role to send signals and link it to the brain. The cerebellum does not initiate skeletal muscle movement, but rather it fine-tunes all the muscle motion after it has been initiated by the primary motor cortex. This allows it so that the motion follows a correct pattern and leads to smooth, coordinated motion. It allows the precise and accurate control. The cells located in here are called Purkinje cells. These are mainly responsible for impulses out of the cerebellum. There's also mossy fibers that are responsible for carrying information through the cerebellum. On the left, you can see the layering of different cell types. So we have the cerebellar cortex on the outside, the molecular layer, the Purkinje cell layer, and the granule layer. The mossy fibers are located on the most deepest side, and they're important for carrying signals around. Some of these neurons that you see here are the longest neurons inside the brain. It also plays a role for maintenance of posture and balance. It receives information from articulations and joints, the muscles of the body, and analyzes information to allow the body to position in a precise manner to control equilibrium. For example, keeping our body upright. These impulses can travel to the deep cerebellar nuclei, to regions of the brainstem, the red nucleus, the midbrain, the cortex, for modulation and precise controlling. Alcohol and certain drugs can have a very detrimental effect on the cerebellum. Intoxication leads to disturbances in our ability to gait, walk, loses our balance, loses our posture, and even inability to detect proprioceptive information. Here is an overview of all the upper motor neurons. So we have the primary motor cortex that sends signals down to the brainstem and to the spinal cord. The thalamus continuously sends signals to the motor cortex, but it's controlled by the basal ganglia, not shown here. So the basal nuclei control the thalamus. And then the cerebellum receives information from the spinal cord, and then it can also send signal back to the thalamus to regulate precise control. So you can see how so many circuits work in the brain to maintain motion control. We have the parietal lobe, primary motor cortex, frontal lobe, temporal lobe, the brain stem, basal nuclei, and then parts of the primary motor cortex as well.